the desert training base, woke long before the sun dared to rise. Floodlights burned against the darkness, casting sharp white lines across the parade ground. Dust drifted lazily in the cold morning air, clinging to boots, uniforms, and lungs. 500 soldiers stood in formation, rows locked tight, shoulders squared, eyes forward. No one spoke. No one moved. Even breathing felt regulated. This was Fort Harrington, a forward U.S. Army installation known for two things: results and silence. It was where careers were forged or buried, where mistakes didn't just cost promotions. Sometimes they cost lives. Captain Alina Brooks stood near the front, perfectly aligned with the soldiers to her left and right. Her posture was immaculate, her face unreadable. If anyone had been watching closely, they might have mistaken her calm for passivity. They would have been wrong. Beneath her pressed uniform rested a service record few people on the base had ever fully read. 2 combat deployments, urban warfare, night extractions under fire, a bronze star she never mentioned, and a citation so heavily redacted that only a handful of senior officers knew what she'd actually done to earn it. Brooks had learned early that competence didn't announce itself. It waited. She scanned the field subtly, noting tension in shoulders, micro-adjustments in stance, the way some soldiers shifted weight to fight the creeping cold. She cataloged everything, because awareness had kept her alive more times than she could count. Across the parade ground, movement cut through the stillness. Colonel Marcus Hale emerged from the command building, flanked by 2 aides. His boots struck the pavement with deliberate weight, each step announcing authority. Hale liked entrances. He liked being seen before he was heard. He was tall, broad-shouldered, silver creeping into his hair in a way that made some people mistake age for wisdom. His uniform was flawless, his ribbons arranged with obsessive precision. To an outsider, he looked like the image of command. To those who served under him, he was something else entirely. Hale stopped at the podium and surveyed the formation, his gaze slow and possessive, as if counting property rather than people. The silence deepened. Soldiers straightened even more if that was possible. This moment was what Hale lived for. His eyes swept across the front ranks and paused, just briefly, on Captain Brooks. No nod, no acknowledgement. Just a cold, lingering stare. Hale didn't dislike Brooks because she failed him. He disliked her because she never needed him. Months earlier, Brooks had transferred to Fort Harrington with little ceremony. No dramatic introduction, no self-promotion. Within weeks, though, patterns emerged. Her unit ran cleaner drills, fewer injuries, faster completion times, better after-action reports. She corrected mistakes quietly, documented everything, never complained. And worst of all, she never flinched when Hale spoke. He had noticed. That morning's formation was for a large-scale training exercise, a simulated urban operation involving live coordination between multiple units. High visibility, high stakes. Hale had personally designed the plan and intended to make an example of discipline and control. He leaned into the microphone. "Today," Hale began, his voice amplified across the field, "we test readiness. Not theory, not excuses, execution." His words were sharp, clipped, familiar. As he outlined the operation, Brooks listened carefully, mentally mapping troop movement, angles of approach, timing windows. Something didn't sit right. The Eastern Corridor assignment. She replayed it again in her head. 2 squads advancing simultaneously, overlapping fields of fire, minimal cover. In a real combat zone, that wasn't just sloppy. It was lethal. Brooks felt a tightening in her chest, not fear but responsibility. She had lost people before, good soldiers, smart soldiers, all because someone higher up had refused to listen. She waited. Hale finished issuing commands and paused, clearly expecting silence. That was how it usually went. Questions were for private briefings, if they were allowed at all. Brooks took one measured step forward. The sound of her boot against gravel felt louder than a gunshot. "Sir," she said calmly, voice steady but clear, "with respect, the Eastern Corridor maneuver creates a crossfire risk. If adjusted 30 meters west, it would." The effect was immediate. Hale turned slowly, as if offended by the mere existence of sound. The parade ground went deathly quiet. 500 soldiers stared straight ahead, but everyone felt it, the shift in pressure, the invisible tightening of a noose. Hale's eyes locked onto Brooks. "Captain," he said, his voice deceptively mild, "did I ask for analysis?" "No, sir," Brooks replied evenly, "but my responsibility is to identify operational risk before." "Your responsibility," Hale cut in, stepping down from the podium, "is to follow orders." He walked toward her, unhurried, each step deliberate. Brooks didn't move, didn't retreat, didn't stiffen. Hale stopped inches from her. "You think," he continued softly, "that because you've been in the field, you get to challenge command in front of my formation." Brooks met his gaze without defiance, without submission. "I think," she said, "that training exists to prevent casualties, sir." That was the moment. Not the slap, not the violence. The moment something inside Hale snapped. The corners of his mouth twitched, not a smile, but something uglier. "Know your place," he said quietly. The words landed like a blade. Somewhere in the ranks a soldier swallowed hard. Another clenched his jaw. No one moved. No one dared. Hale raised his hand. And the world seemed to hold its breath. The slap cracked across the formation, sharp, loud, impossible to ignore. Brooks' head turned slightly from the impact. Her cheek burned. For half a heartbeat, time slowed. She tasted blood. 500 soldiers stood frozen, staring straight ahead as everything they believed about authority, control, and restraint teetered on the edge of collapse. Brooks straightened slowly, returning her head to center. She didn't touch her face. She didn't speak. She didn't look at Hale. But something had changed. And every soldier there felt it. No one in the formation moved. Not after the slap. Not after the sound echoed and died in the cold desert air. 500 soldiers stood locked in place, eyes forward, bodies rigid, every instinct screaming to react, and every year of conditioning forcing them not to. The moment felt unreal, like time itself had stumbled. Colonel Marcus Hale lowered his hand slowly. For half a second he seemed almost surprised by what he had done. Then his expression hardened, jaw tightening as if daring the universe to challenge him. He glanced across the formation, waiting for something, an outburst, a gasp, a protest. Nothing came. Silence had always protected him. Captain Elena Brooks remained perfectly still. Her face showed no anger, no shock, only control. The sting on her cheek burned, but she didn't acknowledge it, not with a flinch, not with a breath out of rhythm. That unsettled Hale more than anything else could have. He turned away from her abruptly, climbing back onto the podium as if the moment had already passed, as if he hadn't just crossed a line visible to everyone present. "Formation," he barked into the microphone, voice loud, sharp, commanding. "You will proceed with the exercise as briefed. Any deviation will be treated as insubordination." His eyes flicked back to Brooks for just a moment. A warning. Then he dismissed the formation. Boots moved in unison. Soldiers broke ranks with mechanical precision, but the energy was wrong. Movements were stiff. Heads stayed down. Conversations didn't start. Everyone had seen it. Everyone would remember it. Inside the command building, Hale slammed his office door shut. The walls were decorated with plaques, commendations, and framed photographs. Hale shaking hands with generals, Hale standing beside flags, Hale at podiums, Hale at ceremonies. Proof of a career built on control. He paced like a caged animal. "How dare she," he muttered, ripping off his gloves and tossing them onto his desk. "In front of my formation." To Hale, the slap wasn't a loss of control. It was a correction. In his mind, Brooks had committed the ultimate sin, public challenge. Rank existed for a reason. Order existed because someone enforced it, and Hale had enforced order his entire career by making sure no one forgot who held power. Fear was efficient. He poured himself a coffee, hands steady, breathing even. If anyone asked, he'd say the incident was exaggerated, a disciplinary gesture, nothing more. That was how it always went. Across the base, however, the ripple had already started. In locker rooms and briefing halls, soldiers spoke in low voices. "Did you see her face? He hit her. She didn't even blink. That was messed up." Some said it with anger, some with disbelief, some with something dangerously close to hope. Captain Brooks, meanwhile, stood alone in her office, staring at the wall. She had replayed the moment a dozen times already, not the slap, but the seconds before it, the decision to speak, the choice to step forward. She knew the risk. She always had. Her cheek throbbed, but she ignored it. Pain was familiar. What sat heavier was the knowledge that something irreversible had begun. A knock came at her door. "Enter." Lieutenant Harris stepped in cautiously. He was young, capable, and loyal, one of the few officers who didn't underestimate her. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "medical asked if you want." "No," Brooks replied, "I'm fine." Harris hesitated. "With respect, what he did is not your concern," she cut in gently. "You have an exercise to prepare for." Harris nodded, but he didn't leave right away. "Ma'am, the soldiers saw it." "I know," Brooks said. That was what worried her most. By evening, Hale had convinced himself the situation was under control. He issued no apology, requested no report. In his world, acknowledging wrongdoing was weakness, and weakness invited challenge. Instead, he doubled down. During the next briefing, he singled out Brooks' unit, scrutinizing every minor detail, criticizing tone, posture, timing. He made a show of it, death by 1,000 cuts. Brooks absorbed it all in silence. That only fueled him. He wanted reaction, resistance, submission. She gave him nothing. To Hale, that felt like defiance. By nightfall, he made his decision. The next morning's formation would be larger, more public. He would remind everyone, especially Captain Brooks, exactly who was in charge. At dawn, the soldiers assembled again. 500 uniforms, 500 silent witnesses. Brooks stood in the same place as before, her face calm, her cheek faintly bruised beneath regulation composure. Some soldiers noticed. Others pretended not to. Hale took the podium. His tone was sharper today, less theatrical, more personal. "We are not a debate club," he snapped. "We are not here for opinions. We are here for obedience." His gaze locked onto Brooks again. "Certain individuals," he continued, "seem to forget that hierarchy exists for a reason." A murmur of discomfort rippled through the ranks, not sound but energy. Brooks felt it, the soldiers felt it. Hale descended from the podium once more. This time his steps were faster. "You think I won't make an example," he said quietly as he approached her again. "You think one correction gives you leverage." Brooks kept her eyes forward. "Answer me," Hale demanded. "Yes, sir," she said evenly. The wrong answer again. Hale's breathing quickened. His pride burned. He leaned in, voice low enough that only those closest could hear. "You don't belong here," he whispered. "People like you forget their place." That word again. Place. The soldiers nearest them felt something tighten in their chests. They knew, somehow, that this was no longer just about rank. It was about humiliation, about dominance. Hale raised his hand. And this time he didn't stop. Brooks moved, not in anger, not in fear, in reflex. Years of combat training surged to the surface, muscle memory honed under fire, drilled into her bones when hesitation meant death. Hale's hand never reached her face. She stepped inside his reach, seized his wrists, and twisted. There was no flourish, no hesitation, just precision. The sound that followed was unmistakable. A collective gasp rippled through the formation as Hale screamed, collapsing to his knees, his authority breaking as cleanly as bone. Brooks released him instantly and stepped back, hands at her sides, eyes forward. The formation froze. No one breathed. No one spoke. The base had just crossed a point of no return. And every soldier there knew. This was only the beginning. For a moment, no one understood what they were seeing. Colonel Marcus Hale was on his knees. Not kneeling in command. Not posing for ceremony. He was collapsed, hunched forward in the dirt, his face twisted in pain so raw it stripped him of every ounce of authority he'd ever wielded. His hands, those hands that had signed orders, ended careers, struck a subordinate, were bent at angles hands were never meant to bend. His scream tore through the parade ground. It was not dignified. It was not controlled. It was human. 500 soldiers stood frozen in formation, their training screaming at them to stay still while instinct begged them to react. Eyes stared straight ahead, yet every sense was locked onto the same impossible truth. Power had fallen. Captain Alina Brooks stood at attention, her posture flawless, her breathing measured. Her hands rested calmly at her sides, fingers relaxed, as if she had just completed a drill exactly as instructed. She did not look at Hale. She did not look at the soldiers. She stared forward, jaw set, eyes steady. The silence that followed was heavier than the scream. Then someone shouted, "Medic!" The spell broke. Chaos rushed in all at once. 2 soldiers broke formation without being ordered, sprinting toward Hale. A medic pushed through the ranks, radio crackling, voice tight with urgency. Officers looked at one another in disbelief, silently asking the same question. "What do we do now?" Hale tried to speak, but it came out as a broken hiss. His face was pale, sweat pouring down his temples despite the cold air. He gasped, "She attacked." His words dissolved into another cry of pain as the medic stabilized his wrists. That was when Brooks finally moved. 1 step back. Perfect alignment. Still at attention. Her voice when it came was calm. "Sir," she said, addressing no one in particular, "Captain Alina Brooks reporting. Colonel Hale initiated physical contact. I responded in self-defense." The words fell into the open air like a live round. Several soldiers felt their throats tighten. Others felt something else entirely, relief maybe, or validation. She hadn't run. She hadn't shouted. She had stated facts. Military police arrived within minutes, their vehicles cutting across the parade ground, red and blue lights flashing against the pale dawn. Their presence shattered any illusion that this could be handled quietly. An MP sergeant approached Brooks cautiously, eyes flicking between her and Hale. "Ma'am," he said, voice careful, "you're going to need to come with us." "Yes, Sergeant," Brooks replied. She turned smoothly, offering her wrists without resistance. The click of handcuffs echoed louder than the slap ever had. Across the formation, jaws clenched. Hale was lifted onto a stretcher, his screams now replaced with furious, broken commands no one acknowledged. As he was carried away, his eyes locked onto Brooks, burning with rage, humiliation, and something else. Fear. Brooks was escorted through the base in silence. Soldiers stopped what they were doing to watch her pass. No one spoke, no one pointed. A few lowered their heads not in shame but respect. Inside the MP holding room, Brooks was seated alone. The door closed with a heavy thud. For the first time since the incident, she exhaled. Her hands trembled slightly, not from doubt, but from the adrenaline draining out of her system. She closed her eyes briefly, grounding herself the way she had learned to do overseas, when explosions faded and the aftermath set in. She knew what was coming. Court-martial was a possibility, discharge, prison. She also knew something else. She had done nothing wrong. Outside that room, the base was buzzing. Rumors spread faster than any official report. He hit her again. She broke both his wrists. She didn't even hesitate. He finally went too far. Junior enlisted soldiers whispered in mess halls. Senior NCOs exchanged grim looks behind closed doors. Officers checked regulations, replayed the moment in their minds, and wondered how much truth would survive the chain of command. Security footage was already being pulled. Audio logs archived. Statements requested. This time, silence wouldn't be enough. By afternoon, the first investigator arrived. Lieutenant Colonel Avery, Judge Advocate General. She reviewed the footage alone. She watched Hale step forward. Watched him raise his hand. Watched Brooks move, controlled, minimal, defensive. Avery paused the video and leaned back in her chair. "This isn't insubordination," she murmured. "This is restraint." She requested Brooks' full-service record. What she found made her sit up straighter. Combat citations, leadership commendations, psychological evaluations noting exceptional impulse control under extreme stress. No history of violence, no disciplinary actions. If Brooks had wanted to hurt Hale, she could have. She hadn't. That evening, Brooks was released from holding, not free, but no longer restrained. She returned to her quarters under escort. The base felt different now, heavier, charged. As she closed her door, she finally allowed herself to touch her cheek. The bruise was darker than she expected. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, meeting her own eyes. "Worth it," she said quietly. Across town, in a private military hospital room, Hale stared at the ceiling. Both arms were immobilized. Painkillers dulled the agony but not the humiliation. His phone buzzed nonstop, missed calls, unanswered messages. For the first time in decades, no one was rushing to defend him. He remembered the look on Brooks' face. Not anger. Not hatred. Control. That terrified him. The following morning, an official announcement echoed across Fort Harrington. Colonel Marcus Hale was relieved of operational command pending investigation. 500 soldiers heard it. And every single one of them knew exactly why. Fort Harrington had never been quiet, but now it was watchful. The morning after Colonel Hale was relieved of command, the base felt like it was holding its breath. Conversations stopped when officers entered rooms. Phones were checked and rechecked. Doors that were once open now stayed closed. Everyone knew something unprecedented was unfolding. Captain Alina Brooks sat alone in a small conference room inside the administrative wing, hands folded neatly on the table. A recorder sat between her and the empty chair across from her, its red light blinking patiently. She had been waiting for nearly 40 minutes. Brooks didn't mind waiting. She had waited in worse places, half-collapsed buildings, dark alleys overseas, listening to radios crackle while decisions were made far above her. Waiting was familiar. What mattered was what came after. The door finally opened. Lieutenant Colonel Avery entered, followed by a civilian analyst and a senior NCO acting as witness. Avery's expression was professional but unreadable. She sat, pressed a button on the recorder, and met Brooks' eyes. "For the record," Avery said, "this is a preliminary inquiry under Article 128 and related conduct violations. "Captain Brooks, do you understand why you're here?" "Yes, ma'am," Brooks replied evenly. Avery nodded. "Start from the beginning." Brooks did. She described the training plan, the tactical concern, her decision to speak up, Hale's words, the slap, the second approach, the moment his hand rose again. She did not embellish. She did not justify. She simply described facts. When she finished, Avery sat back and studied her carefully. "Captain," Avery asked, "why didn't you report the initial strike immediately?" Brooks didn't hesitate. "Because I believe the exercise and the soldiers' safety were still the priority, and because reporting Colonel Hale has historically resulted in consequences." Avery's eyebrow twitched slightly. "Consequences," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am." The civilian analyst scribbled notes faster. Avery leaned forward. "Do you regret your response?" Brooks met her gaze. "No, ma'am." Silence settled between them. Then Avery nodded once and turned off the recorder. Elsewhere on base, pressure was mounting. Senior officers convened behind closed doors, voices low but urgent. Hale had connections, powerful ones, years of favors, careers built with his endorsement. This wasn't just about one incident. This was about precedent. "If we let this stand," one colonel argued, "we open the door to chaos. If we bury it," another countered quietly, "we become complicit." That word hung in the air. Complicit. Outside those rooms, soldiers were talking. Not loudly, not recklessly, but honestly. Stories surfaced, old ones. Times Hale had gone too far, promotions denied without explanation, careers stalled after private conversations, written complaints that disappeared into administrative black holes. And always the same ending. Nothing happened. Until now. In the military hospital, Colonel Hale watched the news cycle unfold from his bed. Both wrists were casted. His pain was constant, but it paled next to the rage boiling beneath it. His phone lay on the bedside table, screen dark. No calls from command. No reassurances. Just one official message. "You are not to contact base personnel pending investigation." Hale clenched his jaw. They were abandoning him. He replayed the moment again and again, not the pain, but the look on Brooks' face. She hadn't panicked. She hadn't hesitated. She had been ready. That realization gnawed at him. By day 3, the investigation expanded. What began as an inquiry into a single altercation widened into a full command climate review. Inspectors arrived. External oversight was requested. Files long untouched were reopened. And then someone found it. A complaint from 6 years earlier. Another captain, different base, same pattern. Dismissed due to lack of corroboration. This time there was corroboration. 500 witnesses. Security footage. Audio logs. A system that suddenly couldn't look away. Brooks continued reporting for duty, restricted, supervised but present. She trained her unit as usual, issued clear instructions, corrected mistakes quietly. The soldiers noticed. One morning, as she walked across the training yard, a private snapped to attention slightly faster than required. Another nodded subtly. An NCO met her eyes and held the gaze. None of it was insubordinate. All of it was deliberate. Respect, once withheld, had found its way back. Avery called Brooks in again, late that afternoon. This time, the tone was different. "Captain," Avery said, sliding a folder across the table, "I want you to read this." Brooks opened it. Inside were copies of prior reports, statements, evaluations. She read silently, her expression unchanged. "These were never supposed to disappear," Avery continued. "They did. Someone made sure of it. Brooks closed the folder. "Ma'am," she said carefully, "with respect, this isn't about me anymore." Avery smiled faintly. "No," she said, "it is." That night, Fort Harrington received another announcement. Short official. Colonel Marcus Hale is formally under investigation for conduct unbecoming, abuse of authority, and assault. The message spread faster than anything before it. In barracks and offices, soldiers sat quietly, absorbing what it meant. The system was no longer protecting him. And systems rarely turned back once they started moving. Brooks lay awake in her quarters, staring at the ceiling. She felt no triumph. Only weight. She knew the cost of what she'd started. Reputations would fall. Lines would be drawn. Some people would resent her forever. But she also knew this. Silence had already cost too much. Outside, the base lights glowed against the dark desert sky, steady and unforgiving. For the first time since arriving at Fort Harrington, Brooks allowed herself a small, controlled breath. Whatever came next. She was ready. The base had changed overnight. Not in appearance, not in drills, not in the hours of work or the sound of boots on gravel. It had changed in spirit. 500 soldiers now moved with a new awareness. That authority was not absolute. That courage could exist quietly, but when it did, it had consequences. Captain Alina Brooks walked the parade ground that morning with her usual precision. She moved like every step was measured, every eye was watching, but this time it didn't matter. She didn't flinch. She didn't adjust her posture to placate anyone. The soldiers noticed. A private in the second row straightened without being told. A corporal in the back of the formation nodded, just slightly, acknowledging her presence. Others followed suit in their own small, subtle ways. None of it was disobedience. All of it was recognition. Hale was not present that morning. He remained confined to the hospital wing, still recovering, still furious, still convinced that what had happened was a mistake that could be corrected with intimidation and connections. But the ripple he had unleashed was unstoppable. Inside the temporary investigation office, Lieutenant Colonel Avery was collecting statements. Soldiers came one after another, some nervous, some defiant, all truthful. "I saw it happen," said Specialist Torr's young voice, shaking but firm. "Captain Brooks didn't strike first. He raised his hand. She defended herself. Fast, clean, precise." Another, Sergeant Hall, older and grizzled, leaned back in his chair. "I've seen officers get slapped around before. I've seen people panic. She didn't. She just acted, and it was over before I could even blink. That's the first time I've seen someone respond like that to him and not get punished." Avery made notes. Every word mattered. Every witness built the story that Hale could no longer control. By mid-afternoon, the investigators had enough corroboration to make a preliminary determination. The act was self-defense. But military bureaucracy moved slowly, and Hale's network of influence was deep. Papers had to be filed, evidence had to be cross-checked, and command channels had to be respected. Brooks knew this. She also knew that every delay was another opportunity for pushback, for Hale's allies to bury the truth, to silence those willing to speak. Meanwhile, Hale was packing his hospital room. Painkillers dulled his wrists, but they did nothing for his rage. "This is temporary," he muttered, gripping the sheets until his knuckles whitened. "She got lucky, that's all." A nurse entered, asking if he wanted ice packs adjusted. He waved her off. His thoughts were elsewhere: plans, letters, phone calls, influence. He had been a master of control for decades, and now none of it mattered. He called a trusted former subordinate who owed him favors. "Do everything you can," he instructed. "Do you understand? I need this contained." The subordinate hesitated. "Sir, the soldiers." "They will obey," Hale snapped. "Do it." Even as he spoke, somewhere in the base, soldiers were quietly preparing to tell the truth. One report, one witness, one fact at a time. The power balance had shifted. That evening, Brooks returned to her quarters after a long day of statements, recordings, and supervision. Her unit had been drilled, orders given, mistakes corrected, discipline maintained, all under the watchful eye of internal investigators. Yet something was different. Where there had been fear, now there was curiosity. Where there had been silence, now there were whispers of admiration. A young lieutenant approached her quietly. "Ma'am, if you need anything, we've got your back." Brooks nodded once, barely perceptible. "I know." It was enough. The next day, a hearing was scheduled for Colonel Hale. Briefing only, preliminary, meant to gauge what the formal investigation would conclude. Brooks was required to attend. She arrived early, dressed sharply, standing apart from the rest of the assembly. She remained calm, composed, neutral, letting others talk, letting others fidget. Hale was wheeled in on a stretcher, cast stark against his uniform, face pale and drawn with anger. But he carried himself like a man who still believed power could override truth. "You know why you're here," said the presiding officer. "Captain Brooks' actions have been questioned, and we need to understand the circumstances." Hale opened his mouth, ready to spin, ready to accuse, ready to dominate the room like he had dominated the base for decades. But then the testimonies began. First, the medics. Second, the soldiers who had witnessed it firsthand. Third, the internal recordings. Each statement layered another truth over Hale's authority. Each fact chipped away at his narrative. Each corroboration made the room less pliable. Hale's face turned red. He tried to interrupt. The presiding officer raised a hand. Silence. Brooks sat listening, not gloating, not anxious, just listening. Because she knew the system didn't punish facts, only fear, and now fear was gone. By the end of the hearing, something unprecedented had happened. The presiding officer concluded the captain's actions were justified. The assault on Colonel Hale was defensive, not aggressive. Her conduct reflected discipline and professionalism. It was the first public acknowledgement that Hale had lost control, that his power, built on intimidation and unchecked authority, was no longer untouchable. In the crowd, soldiers murmured, heads lifted slightly, eyes brightened. Some nodded, others whispered quietly. Some, older and cynical, shook their heads in disbelief, but even they understood the significance. Brooks did not react outwardly. Inside, she allowed herself a brief, private sense of satisfaction. Justice wasn't loud. Justice was precise, measured, and undeniable. That night, as the base quieted, the ripple continued. Soldiers spoke in hushed tones in barracks and mess halls. The story of the slap, the retaliation, the unwavering calm of Captain Brooks, it spread, not as gossip, not as rumor, as truth. And with truth came reflection. Senior NCOs spoke with juniors, carefully guiding the conversation. "Courage isn't always loud," one said. "Sometimes it's standing firm when everyone expects you to break." The younger soldiers listened, eyes wide. Something fundamental shifted in their perception of authority, respect, and courage. Meanwhile, Hale's influence dwindled. Calls went unanswered. Meetings were postponed. Allies whispered that the tide had turned. His name, once synonymous with power, now carried whispers of shame. Brooks did not celebrate. She could not. The fight was not over, but she had made a statement. One individual, disciplined and skilled, could challenge abuse without fear and still uphold the values of the military. That night she wrote in her journal, a habit from deployments long ago. 2 seconds changed everything. Not because I wanted it to. Because someone had to. The base was no longer the same place it had been. Fort Harrington thrummed with a strange energy. The sun rose over the desert in pale streaks, casting long shadows over the training yard. Soldiers moved with purpose, but there was a subtle change in the air, a quiet awareness, a shifting of lines that no one could ignore. Colonel Marcus Hale had been hospitalized, his wrists immobilized in thick casts. Painkillers dulled the physical agony, but humiliation remained sharp, piercing, unrelenting. For the first time in decades, he felt powerless. Hale's world had always been orderly. Authority was law, fear was currency, reputation a shield. And now all of it was gone. Inside the temporary investigation office, Lieutenant Colonel Avery reviewed the evidence for the third time that day. The footage of the confrontation, captured from multiple angles, had been studied down to the smallest detail. Audio logs confirmed every statement from Brooks. Witness statements from soldiers, NCOs, privates, and lieutenants alike lined up perfectly. But it wasn't enough, not yet. The military system was complex, hierarchical, stubborn. Even overwhelming evidence required procedural steps, corroboration, documentation, interviews, formal submissions. Each step allowed room for influence, for delay, for Hale's allies to exert pressure. Avery sighed. She had to anticipate every possible move, and she had to be meticulous. There could be no mistakes, not this time. Meanwhile, Brooks moved through her unit with quiet purpose. The soldiers under her command were tense but attentive. Each drill, each instruction, every correction reinforced discipline, but it carried a subtle, invisible lesson. Integrity and skill mattered more than intimidation. A private whispered to another during a break in formation, "Did you see her face? Calm the whole time, not even flinched." "Yeah," the other replied, "and he's broken both wrists. Can you believe that?" A sergeant overheard but said nothing. A smile flickered briefly across his face, almost imperceptible. Respect was growing in ways Hale could never have bought, bullied, or coerced. Hale's hospital room was a different world. He stared at the ceiling, waiting, scheming, calculating. Calls to former allies went unanswered. Officers who once deferred to his authority now avoided eye contact. His network, the invisible web that had always protected him, had frayed. "I won't be undone," he muttered to himself, hands curled around the bedsheet. "I have control. I always have control." But control is an illusion, and in Hale's case, it was slipping through his fingers faster than he could comprehend. The investigation intensified. Auditors, legal teams, and internal investigators combed through records. Files from previous bases were retrieved, revealing a history of misconduct previously buried. Complaints about intimidation, unfair disciplinary actions, and unreported harassment. One report, nearly 6 years old, described a junior officer's complaint about Hale's public humiliation tactics. The complaint had disappeared into the bureaucratic void, dismissed for lack of corroboration. Now it mattered. Avery reviewed the report carefully. Each line highlighted a pattern, a system of abuse that had been ignored, tolerated, or actively concealed. "This isn't just about today," Avery said aloud to herself. "It's a lifetime of behavior." Soldiers began to speak quietly, cautiously, but truth has a way of spreading faster than fear. In the mess hall, whispers became conversation. "I've seen him do it before," said a staff sergeant. "Pulled people aside, humiliated them in front of their units, and no one ever said anything." "He hit her," another officer added, "and she didn't even hesitate. That's unbelievable." The younger soldiers stared, absorbing the stories, realizing something they had not before. Courage was not loud. Courage could be quiet, precise, and devastatingly effective. The morale shift was subtle but unmistakable. Soldiers straightened a little more, spoke a little more honestly, and walked with an awareness that the old rules of fear no longer applied. Hale, meanwhile, attempted to intervene. He drafted messages, contacted former mentors, even tried to involve the base's higher-ups. Every attempt to sway opinion or obscure the truth failed. Commanders were wary now. The evidence was too clear, the witnesses too numerous, the soldiers too attentive to ignore. Hale's influence, once untouchable, was crumbling. A key turning point came during a private session with the presiding officer. Brooks entered the room alone, calm and poised. The officer reviewed new evidence, audio recordings, witness testimonies, and Hale's own statements from the hospital. "This is overwhelming," Avery said quietly. "We have corroboration from multiple sources, video, medical reports, testimonies from soldiers who are willing to speak. This is not ambiguous." Brooks nodded slightly. "I want the truth to be clear, ma'am. Nothing else matters." Her quiet determination impressed even Avery, a seasoned officer accustomed to navigating complex investigations. Brooks wasn't seeking revenge or recognition. She sought accountability. Back on the base, Hale's situation worsened. Internal memos leaked quietly. His reputation, meticulously built over decades, was under scrutiny. Allies who once backed him hesitated. Even those loyal to him began calculating the cost of continued support. In the barracks, whispers turned to discussion. Soldiers shared what they had seen, confirming facts independently. Even the most skeptical began to acknowledge Brooks' professionalism and restraint. One sergeant summed it up. "She didn't break protocol, she didn't lose control. He did, and we all saw it." By the end of the week, Hale's position was untenable. The investigation concluded its preliminary phase. Recommendations were drafted. Hale was removed from all command authority pending formal hearings. His career, once a fortress, was now crumbling. Brooks, meanwhile, resumed her duties with caution but confidence. She continued to lead her unit, drill her soldiers, and oversee operations. She didn't gloat. She didn't speak of the incident, but the subtle shift in her unit's respect and focus was tangible. Soldiers moved with renewed clarity. Mistakes were corrected promptly. Orders were executed with precision, and a growing awareness that courage and integrity mattered as much as rank. That night, Brooks reflected quietly. She had survived confrontation, injustice, and intimidation. She had acted decisively under pressure without hesitation, but she understood the cost. Careers would be altered, loyalties tested. The base would never return to what it had been. And that was the point. Somewhere in the distance, lights on the parade ground flickered under the desert sky. The base, once a place where fear dictated obedience, was shifting toward a new understanding. That authority without accountability is fragile, and courage, however quiet, can change everything. Brooks allowed herself a brief, controlled breath. She had done what was necessary. The rest, Hale's downfall, the institution's reckoning, would follow its course. And for the first time in years, Fort Harrington felt alive. By the 7th day after the incident, Fort Harrington was a different place. The desert sun rose over the parade ground, bright and harsh, but it no longer illuminated just uniforms and formations. It revealed truths that had long been hidden. Soldiers walked with eyes wider, backs straighter, heads held a little higher. Respect was no longer a product of fear. It was earned. Colonel Marcus Hale had become the epicenter of a storm he could not control. Every call he made to former allies went unanswered. Emails were ignored. Attempts to influence the investigation were met with polite but firm refusals. His network, built over decades, had dissolved under the weight of evidence. The investigation itself had evolved into a formal inquiry. Lieutenant Colonel Avery had compiled an exhaustive report, statements from soldiers across ranks, medical reports detailing Hale's injuries, previous complaints buried in archives, and surveillance footage that left no doubt of the sequence of events. The pattern was undeniable. Hale had abused authority repeatedly, and Brooks had acted decisively in self-defense. Even the military hierarchy could not ignore it. Hale was now confined to his hospital room, wrists immobilized, rage simmering beneath the surface. I will not be humiliated like this, he told himself, gripping the bed rails. I will make them pay. They will regret this. But the soldiers he once intimidated were no longer afraid. Specialist Tors, the young soldier who had witnessed the slap, spoke quietly with a group of peers in the barracks. I thought no one would stand up to him, Tors said. But she did, and now we don't have to. I know, replied Sergeant Hall, older and grizzled. I've seen officers break under fire. I've seen soldiers panic, but she was ready, calm, precise, and now everyone knows it. Word spread quickly through whispers and hushed conversations. By the evening, morale had shifted entirely. Soldiers who once flinched at Hale's presence now exchanged glances filled with respect for Brooks, admiration for her composure, and disbelief at the colonel's fall. The presiding officer scheduled a formal hearing. It was held in a secure briefing room with the top brass observing. Soldiers were allowed to attend as witnesses. The room was tense, the air heavy with anticipation. Everyone knew the significance of what was about to unfold. Hale was wheeled in on a stretcher, his face pale, his expression rigid. The first thing he noticed was the attention, not just from the officers but from the soldiers. 500 pairs of eyes, some curious, some defiant, all attentive. He realized that for the first time in decades, he was powerless in front of the people who once obeyed without question. Brooks entered calmly, standing apart from the commotion. Her cheek still bore a faint bruise, her uniform immaculate. Her posture was perfect. She didn't speak. She didn't move unnecessarily. She merely observed. The presiding officer addressed Hale first. Colonel Hale, you are here to respond to allegations of abuse of authority and assault. You are reminded that you may speak, but you must be truthful. Hale opened his mouth, trying to project strength, authority, control, but the words faltered. His past, once invisible, now pressed against him. One by one, witnesses recounted the events. Medics confirmed the extent of Hale's injuries. Soldiers testified that Brooks had acted purely in self-defense. Investigators presented prior complaints, previously ignored, detailing a pattern of intimidation, harassment, and misuse of authority. The evidence was overwhelming. Hale tried to interject, tried to assert his version of events, but each statement was countered by facts, documents, and recordings. The room itself seemed to tilt against him. For the first time he felt doubt, not in the soldiers, not in the process, but in himself. He realized the narrative he had controlled for decades, the one built on fear and manipulation, was crumbling. By the end of the day, the conclusion was clear. The presiding officer's words were simple and decisive. Colonel Marcus Hale is relieved of all command authority, pending further action. His conduct violated the standards of this service. He is hereby removed from his position and subjected to a formal review of his career and actions. The soldiers present didn't cheer, they didn't clap, but the room's atmosphere shifted subtly. Breaths were steadier, postures relaxed. Even the most cynical officers understood the significance. The system, for once, had worked in favor of integrity. Back on the base, reactions were swift. Junior officers shared the news quietly. Enlisted soldiers exchanged looks of disbelief and relief. Word reached the barracks within hours. Hale's influence had ended. Some soldiers had anticipated Brooks' vindication. Others had quietly doubted it. Now the doubt was gone. The truth had been made clear for everyone to see. Even more significant was the effect on morale. Soldiers who once moved under fear now moved under respect. Orders were executed with precision, not terror. Mistakes were corrected with guidance, not intimidation. The culture of fear that had permeated Fort Harrington for decades was beginning to dissipate. Hale's hospital room became a place of isolation. Former allies avoided him. Requests for meetings went unanswered. Even the nurses who had once deferred to his authority now treated him as a patient, not a commander. He called one of his most loyal subordinates late that night. "You must fix this," he barked. "I will not be undone." The subordinate hesitated, voice low. "Sir, it's too late. Everyone knows." Hale's rage boiled. He slammed the phone down, breathing hard, but he understood deep down that the system had shifted. Brooks, meanwhile, returned to her quarters quietly. She did not celebrate. She did not announce her triumph. She allowed herself only a small, private moment of reflection. She had acted decisively under pressure. She had maintained composure. She had protected herself and upheld the values she believed in. The soldiers who had witnessed her actions now carried a quiet lesson forward. Authority is earned, courage matters, and fear is not respect. Brooks wrote briefly in her journal, "Power can be abused, courage can be quiet, justice is precise, and sometimes 2 seconds are all it takes to change everything." That night the desert wind swept across Fort Harrington. Lights flickered against the dark horizon. Soldiers moved through the base, talking quietly, nodding to one another, exchanging subtle signs of renewed respect. The ripple created by Brooks' actions would continue far beyond the immediate consequences. And Hale's fall, once thought impossible, served as a stark warning. No one, no matter how powerful, is untouchable when the truth is undeniable. The base had witnessed history in its own small, disciplined way. And at the center of it, Captain Alina Brooks stood calm, composed, and unwavering. Her place had never been below anyone. It had always been exactly where she stood. The sun rose over Fort Harrington like any other morning, but nothing felt ordinary. The desert air was crisp, dry, and sharp, carrying a subtle electricity. Soldiers walked across the parade ground with purpose, heads high, boots striking in measured rhythm. There was a new energy, something intangible but unmistakable, the quiet sense that fairness, courage, and integrity had finally asserted themselves. Captain Alina Brooks walked among her unit, her steps steady, posture perfect, face calm. Every soldier under her command felt it, authority earned, not demanded, respect, not fear. This was a victory not just for her, but for every soldier who had ever felt powerless under the weight of unchecked authority. Colonel Marcus Hale had been permanently relieved of command. Investigations had concluded that his career, once celebrated for decades, was marred by abuse, intimidation, and misconduct. All pending evaluations, command privileges, and operational responsibilities were stripped from him. Hale remained on base only temporarily, under strict supervision, waiting for formal reassignment or discharge. He no longer had influence. He no longer had respect. And for the first time in decades, he truly understood what it meant to be powerless. The hospital room that had once felt like sanctuary for him now felt like a cage. Nurses and medics treated him professionally, but without deference. Former allies no longer returned calls. Even the commanding officers who had once deferred to him treated him like any other officer. No special privileges, no special consideration. It was a collapse of a career built on intimidation and fear. Meanwhile, Brooks' reputation soared. Lieutenant Colonel Avery formally recommended her for promotion and a commendation. Her leadership, composure, and integrity under pressure had not only prevented potential harm, but had shifted the culture of the base. Soldiers and officers alike were noticing. The recommendation cited her exceptional courage under threat of physical harm, adherence to protocol under extraordinary pressure, and unwavering commitment to the welfare of her unit. Brooks accepted the commendation quietly, her expression calm, measured. She did not seek the spotlight. She had acted because it was right, not because she sought recognition. But recognition followed her anyway. On the parade ground, a ceremony was held. Soldiers formed ranks. NCOs straightened their posture. Enlisted personnel watched quietly, eyes wide with admiration. Lieutenant Colonel Avery officiated. She spoke not of punishment but of example. Captain Alina Brooks, Avery said, voice steady, has demonstrated the highest standards of military conduct, courage, and leadership. She has upheld the values of this institution in the face of intimidation and threat. Let her actions serve as a model for all who serve here. Brooks stood at attention, expression neutral. The soldiers in the formation, 500 of them, felt the weight of what had transpired. Some remembered the slap. Some remembered the moment she had broken Hale's wrists in self-defense. All of them understood what it meant. Fear could no longer dictate respect. Even those closest to Hale had to acknowledge it. Former subordinates who had once followed him unquestioningly approached Avery privately, confirming testimonies. Officers who had hesitated to act found their courage emboldened by Brooks' example. The culture of silence, long accepted, began to crack. It was slow, imperceptible, but inevitable. Back in her quarters that evening, Brooks allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. She stared at her reflection in the mirror. Her cheek, once bruised, had faded. Her uniform remained immaculate, but the face staring back at her was not the same one that had entered the parade ground a week ago. It was a face that had faced intimidation and abuse, and had remained calm, composed, and principled. A face that had acted decisively when others might have hesitated. A face that had changed a system, however slightly, forever. She wrote in her journal, "Integrity is not loud, courage is not always visible, and sometimes 2 seconds are all it takes to set things right." The base itself began to transform. Senior NCOs spoke more openly with juniors. Officers engaged their units with guidance rather than intimidation. Soldiers corrected mistakes with constructive feedback rather than fear-driven punishment. A subtle shift of power, respect, and accountability spread like sunlight through the base. Fort Harrington had been tested. It had been forced to confront decades of unspoken abuses, and in the process it had learned a new lesson: authority without integrity is fragile. Leadership without respect is temporary. Courage, even from one person, can inspire a new order. Colonel Hale, meanwhile, had retreated into the shadows of his hospital wing, nursing his pride and reflecting on the consequences of unchecked arrogance. He could no longer intimidate. He could no longer command unquestioned obedience. The soldiers who once feared him now spoke of him quietly, carefully, with the mixture of pity and disbelief that comes when someone powerful falls from grace. For Hale, the lesson was cruelly simple. No matter how long you have controlled others with fear, one decisive act of courage, grounded in principle, executed with precision, can unravel decades of authority in moments. Weeks later, Fort Harrington resumed normal operations, but normal was different now. Soldiers trained harder, not because of fear, but because they were inspired. Officers led with transparency. Commanders were held accountable. And among it all, Captain Alina Brooks continued her work quietly, effectively, without fanfare. Her story of composure under threat, of standing firm against intimidation, of acting decisively, was already being discussed quietly among recruits, whispered from barracks to briefing rooms. And the lesson was clear: no one is untouchable. Courage and integrity can topple even the most entrenched power. Respect must be earned, not demanded. As the sun set over Fort Harrington, the base hummed with quiet purpose. Captain Alina Brooks stood on the parade ground one last time for the day, watching her soldiers. She did not smile. She did not speak. She simply observed. The desert wind carried the dust across the empty drill fields, across the long shadows of the parade ground. And in those shadows, the soldiers who had witnessed history remembered one truth above all: one act of courage can change everything. Brooks turned and walked away, calm, composed, unshaken, a leader forged not by fear but by principle. And in her wake, a new order was quietly born.